Wade controversial?
The 1973 Supreme Court decision in the case of Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in the United States and has probably engendered more public controversy than any other legal decision of the late 20th century. Women's access to safe abortion continues to be the subject of debate. At issue in legal cases, and has inspired overzealous anti-abortion activists to violence against doctors who perform abortions and office workers in women's health clinics. The 7 Supreme Court justices who issued the majority decision became the recipients of thousands of letters of hatred, some of them threatening. The case was brought as a class action suit, representing all pregnant women, by 21-year-old Norma McCorvey, 1947. Who has since the ruling reversed her feeling and joined the anti-abortion camp as a right-to-life advocate. But in 1969, under the alias Jane Roe, McCorvey claimed that Texas's abortion law, on the books since 1859, violated her constitutional rights and those of other women. The other party named in the case was Texas District Attorney Henry B. Wade, 1914 to 2001, who argued to uphold Texas state law that punished anyone who gave an abortion. Despite the fact that the ruling in the case would do nothing to help McCorvey, for whom even a favorable decision would come too late to end her unwanted pregnancy, her lawyers, Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington, agreed to pursue the case as a test. The crux of the plaintiff's case is best summed up by arguments made before the Supreme Court, when in December 1971, Weddington argued that Texas's ability to compel women to bear children infringed on a woman's right to control her own life. It was therefore a violation of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which forbids states to make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. In response to defense claims that the fetus is entitled to protection, Weddington averred, "The Constitution as I read it, attaches protection to the person at the time of birth." These arguments, and those of the defense, were presented twice to the Supreme Court. After the first presentation, the 7 justices then seated concluded that such an important decision should not be made until the 2 newly appointed justices could participate. In October 1972 the case was heard again. As it turned out, the 2 new judges represented 1 majority vote and 1 dissenting vote. The majority decision was read by Justice Harry Blackmun on January 22, 1973. The High Court overturned all state laws restricting women's access to abortions. The decision was based on the court's opinion that existing laws banning abortions had been enacted to protect the health of American women, since abortion had previously been a risky medical procedure, and that with advances in medicine this protection was no longer necessary or valid. The court also agreed that the Constitution's implied right to privacy, as found in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty, or in the 9th Amendment's reservation of rights to the people, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision to terminate her pregnancy. Two justices dissented in the opinion, with Justice Byron White writing that the court had sustained a position that values the convenience, whim or caprice of the putative mother more than life or the potential life of the fetus. Nearly 3 decades after the landmark decision, opinion continues to divide along such lines.
When did the United Nations begin its work?
The United Nations, UN, began fulfilling its mission very soon after it was chartered. The first meeting was held January 10, 1946, when the inaugural session of the General Assembly opened in London. On February 14, the UN voted to make its headquarters in the United States. Its complex was built in Manhattan, overlooking New York's East River, in 1950.
How many nations are members of the UN today?
In 2005, the United Nations, UN, membership stood at 191 nations, with the most recent additions having been Switzerland and Timor-Leste, East Timor, in 2002. The membership of the UN grew steadily after it was founded in 1945. Originally there were 51 member states, including Canada, France, the United Kingdom, the USSR, today the Russian Federation, and the United States. Within a decade, 25 more countries had been added to the UN's membership roster. By 1965 there were 117 members, by 1975 144 members, by 1985 159 members, and by 1995 185 members.
Who coined the term Iron Curtain?
It was former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965. In a March 1946 speech in Fulton, Missouri, he remarked that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The statesman, who had been instrumental in coordinating the Allied victory in World War II, 1939-45, was commenting on Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's, 1879-1953, tactics in Eastern Europe, which indicated the Soviets were putting up barriers against the West and building up Soviet domination behind those barriers. Just as he had issued warnings of the threat posed by Nazi Germany prior to World War II. Churchill astutely observed the rapidly emerging situation in Eastern Europe. In 1946 the Soviets installed communist governments in neighboring Romania and in nearby Bulgaria. In 1947 Hungary and Poland came under communist control as well. And the following year, communists took control of Czechoslovakia. These countries, along with Albania, Yugoslavia, and East Germany, soon formed a coalition of communist allies and the Eastern Bloc was formed. The United States and its democratic allies formed the Western Bloc. The stage was set for the Cold War, 1947–89.
What does the Security Council do?
According to the UN Charter, the functions and powers of the Security Council are to maintain international peace and security in accordance with the principles and purposes of the United Nations, to investigate any dispute or situation which might lead to international friction, to recommend methods of adjusting such disputes or the terms of settlement, to formulate plans for the establishment of a system to regulate armaments, to determine the existence of a threat to the peace or act of aggression and to recommend what action should be taken, to call on members to apply economic sanctions and other measures not involving the use of force to prevent or stop aggression, to take military action against an aggressor, to recommend the admission of new members, to exercise the trusteeship functions of the United Nations in strategic areas, and to recommend to the General Assembly the appointment of the Secretary General and, together with the Assembly, to elect the judges of the International Court of Justice.
Why was the completion of the Erie Canal important to you? S. Development.
Completed in 1825, the Erie Canal joined the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, linking the east with the west and for the first time allowing freight and settlers to easily move back and forth between the regions. Begun on July 4, 1817, the canal was sponsored by Governor DeWitt Clinton. 1769–1828, of New York, who planned and eventually carried out the huge building project. The waterway was funded by the state of New York, which paid just over $7 million to complete it. The original canal was 363 miles long, 40 feet wide at the surface, and 4 feet deep. It had 83 locks, which raised vessels 562 feet between the Hudson River and Lake Erie. A lock is a section of a canal that can be closed to control the water level, and is then used to either raise or lower a vessel to another body of water. Beginning at Albany, New York, on the Hudson River, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean at New York City. The canal extends west as far as Buffalo, New York, on Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes. The waterway, which was inaugurated by the run of the barge Seneca Chief on October 26, 1825, could transport passengers aboard boats and move cargo aboard barges, which were pulled by teams of horses and mules on the ground. In spite of the critics, who dubbed the ambitious project Clinton's Wonder and Clinton's Ditch, the canal's positive impact on the American economy was felt within the first decade of its operation. The new transportation route reduced freight rates both eastward and westward, made Buffalo a major port in the region and New York City a major international port, was a catalyst for population growth. In upstate New York and throughout the Old Northwest, the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, and prompted other states, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, to build canals, further opening up the country's interior to development and commerce. Since crops could be shipped from these lush farmlands and as more farms came into existence, the Erie Canal helped supply the newly arrived immigrants in the eastern cities with food. In turn, they shipped manufactured goods west to the farming communities. The canal was enlarged several times between 1835 and 1862 to increase its capacity. In 1903, New York voted to link the canal with 3 shorter waterways in the state to form the New York State Barge Canal, which opened in 1918.
What does the UN do?
Representatives of member countries work to keep peace and ensure security for people around the globe. Over the decades, the UN has expanded its role as a provider of humanitarian aid and stepped up its efforts in the area of human rights. When disputes arise, the UN works toward diplomatic resolution. Though not always successful in its role as peacekeeper or peace negotiator, the organization has provided a forum for debate, which has prevented some disputes from developing into major wars. And through its various agencies, the UN provides assistance to developing nations, promotes humanitarian causes, and sends relief to war-torn areas. However, critics have charged the international organization with arbitrarily defining borders between countries, saying that these drawn boundaries divide ethnic groups and result in conflicts, such as in the Middle East and Africa.
What was the lasting effect of the Clarence Earl Gideon trials?
A 51-year-old drifter charged with burglary in Panama City, Florida, Clarence Earl Gideon had 2 trials. In 1961 and 1963. But it's what happened between the 2 trials that is important to every American today. What might have been pretty standard fare in the day-to-day business of the American justice system? Gideon was charged with robbing a cigarette machine and a jukebox. The Gideon case instead made history when the defendant successfully argued that his constitutional rights had been denied when he was refused an attorney. Though he had a limited education, after a guilty verdict was handed down in his 1961 trial, Gideon knew enough about his rights to petition the Supreme Court, saying that his right to a fair trial, guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment, had been violated. Since he was not able to hire a lawyer to defend himself, the trial had not been fair. The petition, one of thousands the Supreme Court receives each year, somehow rose to the top. The High Court heard Gideon's case and agreed with his conclusion, calling it an obvious truth, and clearly stating that any person haled into court who is too poor to hire a lawyer, cannot be assured a fair trial unless counsel is provided for him. For Gideon, the opinion served to throw out the first trial, for the rest of America. It was assurance that regardless of the crime, a defendant would be guaranteed legal counsel. With the benefit of that counsel, Gideon's case was retried in 1963. He was acquitted on all charges.
Were any 9/11 conspirators convicted?
Yes, but by 2005 there had been only one. French citizen Zacharias Moussaoui, 1968, was convicted in A.U.'s court in Alexandria, Virginia. In connection with the September 11, 2001, attacks that claimed nearly 3,000 lives, Moussaoui was taken into custody by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. In August 2001, a flight instructor in Minnesota, where he was training, had reported him as suspicious. After the September terrorist attacks, Moussaoui continued to be held as the possible 20th hijacker. One of the flights on September 11 had 4 hijackers, the other 3 flights each had 5. For the next 3 years, the suspected terrorist was the subject of a sometimes dramatic legal battle. Moussaoui insulted the U.S. District Judge hearing his case, attempted to fire his lawyers, and pleaded guilty only to later change his mind. On April 22, 2005, the case came to close when Moussaoui admitted his guilt in front of a packed courtroom. His sentencing trial was set for 2006.
What was the Comstock load?
The richest silver mine in the United States, the Comstock lode was also plentiful in gold. The ore deposit was found in 1857 at Mount Davidson in western Nevada, about 16 miles southeast of Reno. The discoverers, Ethan Allen Grosh and Hosea Ballou Grosh, died before they could record the claim. American prospector Henry T. P. Comstock, 1820–1870, laid claim to the lode in 1859. But later sold it for an insignificant amount compared to what it was worth. The mine flourished until 1865 and again between 1873 and 1882, when the Big Bonanza, a super-rich ore vein, yielded more than $100 million. By 1882 the mine had yielded $397 million in ore and had produced half the United States silver output during the period. Western Nevada had become a hotbed of mining activity, attracting numerous prospectors. Among those who made their fortune from the Comstock lode was American mining magnate and future Senator George Hearst, 1820–1891. He used his fortune to buy the San Francisco Examiner in 1880, which was taken over by his son. American newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst, 1863–1951, 7 years later. Virginia City, established in 1859 at the site of the discovery, became one of the West's boomtowns during the late 1800s. By 1898 the mines at the Comstock lode were all but abandoned. Wasteful mining methods and the demonetization of silver brought its demise.
What does laissez-faire mean?
From the French, laissez-faire literally means to let people do as they choose. As an economic doctrine, laissez-faire opposes government interference in economic and business matters, or at least desires to keep government's role to an absolute minimum. Laissez-faire favors a free market, a market characterized by open competition. The theory was popularized during the late 18th century as a reaction to mercantilism. Noted Scottish economist Adam Smith, 1723–1790, was among the advocates of a laissez-faire market.
Citizens were encouraged to build bomb shelters. School children participated in air raid drills. Civil defense films, such as How Can I Stay Alive in an Atom Bomb Blast?
Were screened, and entire towns conducted tests of how residents would respond in the event of an A-bomb. Meantime, the leak of top-secret information from the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, New Mexico, was traced to New York City machine shop owner Julius Rosenberg, his wife, and her brother, David Greenglass. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin writes that the short, plump Mrs. Rosenberg looked more like one of my friend's mothers than an international spy. Indeed, the case marked the first time American civilians were charged with espionage. And the trial made international headlines. Though the Rosenbergs were only two of many involved in the conspiracy, theirs was the heaviest of the punishments handed down in the cases against the spy ring. For their betrayal and their refusal to talk, the Rosenbergs were sentenced to death. In issuing the sentence, Judge Irving Kaufman accused the couple of having altered the course of history. The penalty rocked the world, as Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter put it. They were tried for conspiracy and sentenced for treason. They were electrocuted the evening of June 19, 1953, as New York's Union Square filled with an estimated 10,000 protesters.
What were indentured servants?
During colonial times in America, there were two kinds of indentured servants, voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary servants were people, often trained in a craft or skill, who could not afford passage to the colonies. In exchange for their passage, they agreed to work for a period of 4 to 7 years for a colonial master. At the end of this period, the servant became a freeman and was usually granted land, tools, or money by the former master. Involuntary indentured servants were criminals whose sentence was a period of servitude. The impoverished, or those in debt. Most indentured servants were involuntary. Their period of obligation to a colonial master was longer than that of a voluntary servant, usually 7 to 14 years. But, like their counterparts, the involuntary servants also received land, tools, or money at the end of their contract, and they, too, became freemen. The arrival of indentured servants in the American colonies addressed a labor shortage that emerged in the early 1600s. In 1618 the Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise that encouraged the development of Virginia, adopted a new charter based on the head right system. Englishmen who could pay their own Atlantic crossing were granted 50 acres of land. Each of their sons and servants were also granted an additional 50 acres. Other colonies were also developed under the head right system, with the land amounts varying by colony. Soon there were more farms than there was labor to work the fields. The colonists solved this problem through the system of indentured servitude. Many indentured servants were drawn from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. In European ports, people contracted themselves or became involuntarily contracted to ship captains, who transported them to the colonies, where their contracts were sold to the highest bidder. Roughly half the colonial immigrants were indentured servants. Colonial laws ensured servants would fulfill the term of their obligation. Any servant who ran away was severely punished. Laws also protected the servants, whose masters were obligated to provide them with housing, food, medical care, and even religious training. The system was prevalent in the mid-Atlantic colonies, but it was also used in the South. When the economies of the Caribbean islands failed at the end of the 1600s, plantation owners sold their slaves to the mainland, where they worked primarily on southern plantations, replacing indentured servants by about 1700. In other colonies, the system ended with the American Revolution, 1775 to 83.
What was the biggest gold rush?
The greatest American gold rush began on January 24, 1848, when James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. Within a year, a large-scale gold rush was on. As the nearest port, the small town of San Francisco grew into a bustling city as fortune seekers arrived from around the world. Due to the influx, by 1850 California had enough people to qualify it for statehood. This pattern repeated itself elsewhere in the American West, including the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1859, which effectively launched the city of Denver, Colorado. The gold rush led to the discovery of copper, lead, silver, and other useful minerals. It also spawned related industry. One of the success stories is that of Levi Strauss, 1829 to 1902. A Bavarian immigrant who in 1853 began making and selling sturdy clothing to miners in San Francisco. In other countries, gold rushes had the same effect on the growth and development of regions. After the precious metal was discovered in Australia in 1851, the country's population almost tripled over the course of the next decade. The effect of an 1861 gold rush in nearby New Zealand was to double the country's population in 6 years' time. An 1886 discovery in South Africa led to the development of the city of Johannesburg. Just over a decade later, the infamous Yukon Gold Rush in the Klondike region of Canada spurred development there.
What were the sentences in the Beltway sniper cases?
The October 2002 shootings that left 10 people dead and 3 critically injured in the Washington, D.C. area set off a flurry of legal activity, which was still underway 3 years later. 2 men had been found guilty by juries in separate trials in Virginia in late 2003, John Allen Muhammad, born John Allen Williams 1960-, was sentenced to death, and accomplice Lee Boyd Malvo, aka John Lee Malvo 1985-, received life imprisonment without parole. Since he was a minor at the time of the shooting spree, the death penalty could not be applied in his case. In October 2004, under a plea deal in 2 other Beltway sniper cases, Malvo received other sentences of life imprisonment without parole and 8 years on gun charges. Muhammad and Malvo were arrested on October 24, 2002, in connection with the Beltway sniper attacks. The random shootings, which terrified suburban Washington and gripped the nation, began with a killing in a grocery store parking lot in Wheaton, Maryland, on the evening of October 2. Within the next 16 hours there were 4 more shootings and 4 more dead. By October 22 there were 8 more sniper shootings, 3 of the victims survived. People were targeted as they went about their daily busyness, pumping fuel outside gas stations, loading parcels into their cars in parking lots, arriving at school, and crossing streets. Tips led investigators to issue federal warrants for Muhammad's and Malvo's arrests on October 23, 2002. They were taken into custody early the following morning at a rest stop in Maryland. The 2 men faced charges in several states as well as the District of Columbia. In addition to Virginia and Maryland, the pair had been tied to crimes in the state of Washington, where their journey had begun, as well as in Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia. In 2005, with Malvo behind bars for life and Malvo awaiting a death sentence, prosecutors still wanted the 2 tried in other cases, as insurance against reversals on appeals and as closure for the families of victims. But legal analysts questioned the high price of further trials, defense costs alone for Muhammad and Malvo, who received court-appointed, and publicly paid, defenders, were expected to near $1 million. The highly publicized sniper shootings added strength to the gun control lobby. According to federal law, neither Muhammad nor Malvo could buy firearms. The weapon they used in their deadly spree was shoplifted from a Tacoma, Washington, gun store. The store owner and the gun manufacturer were named in a civil suit by the legal action. Project of the Brady Center to prevent gun violence on behalf of the victims and their families. In 2004, a $2.5 million settlement was reached in the case.
When was the euro introduced?
The euro, the currency of the 12 European Union nations: Belgium, Germany, Greece, Spain, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Austria, Portugal, and Finland went into circulation January 1, 2002, becoming part of daily life for more than 300 million people. The banknotes and coins replaced national currencies, making the franc, Deutschmark, peseta, and lira, among others, history in the participating nations. The euro's origins can be traced to a series of international agreements. Beginning in 1978, which were made among the members of what was then called the European Community, or EC. In February 1986, the framework for the unified monetary system was agreed upon by nations who signed the Single European Act, creating an area without internal frontiers, in which the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital is ensured. The 1989 Delors report outlined a plan to introduce the currency in 3 phases. The final phase of that plan began on January 1, 1999, when the 11 countries, later to become 12, belonging to the European Union, established the conversion rates between their respective national currencies and the euro, creating a monetary union with a single currency. A 3-year transition phase followed, during which monetary transactions could be made in euro, but there was no requirement to do so. On January 1, 2002, the central banks of the 12 participating countries put into circulation about 7.8 billion euro notes and 40.4 billion euro coins, together worth 144 billion euros. Simultaneously, each country began to withdraw its own currency from circulation. By February 28, 2002, the changeover was complete, meaning the national currencies were completely withdrawn and only the euro was in circulation. When 10 new nations, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia, joined the EU on May 1, 2004, there was no timetable for their adoption of the euro. Previously, in 2003, Sweden voted against joining the euro area.
What is the G8?
It is the Group of 8, an annual meeting of the world's leading industrial democracies. Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It began as the Group of 6, with the 1975 conference in France, where representatives of 6 nations, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, met to discuss international economic and political issues. The goal of the meeting was to shore up cooperation on matters of concern to the member nations. Canada joined the group in 1976 and Russia in 1994, though the nation did not participate fully in the sessions until 1998. Hosting responsibilities rotate among the 8 member countries. In 2004, the United States hosted the 30th meeting, on an island off the coast of Georgia. Among the agenda items were the training of international peacekeepers, setting up a global initiative to develop a human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, vaccine, and developing a plan to end famine in the Horn of Africa. Easternmost Africa, including Somalia, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. By 2009, the leaders and representatives of non-G8 countries were invited to participate in discussions relevant to them.
When was modern Israel established?
As a modern state, Israel was formed by decree in 1948. In the wake of World War II, 1939–45. The United Nations, UN, formed a special committee to address the British control of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. The narrow piece of land comes to a point in the south, where it fronts the Gulf of Aqaba. In November 1947, the United Nations, UN, carved Israel out of the Palestine region. Areas of Palestine that were not designated as Israel were divided between neighboring Arab countries. Modern Israel's first leader, David Ben-Gurion, 1886–1973, proclaimed an independent Israel on May 14, 1948. Born in Poland, Ben-Gurion had arrived in Palestine as a young man of about 20 and became extremely active in efforts to assert Jewish autonomy in the region. He served as Prime Minister from 1949 to 1953 and again between 1955 and 1963. But Israel's history goes back much farther than these 20th-century events. And, having such a long history, it is also a complicated one. Israel was an ancient kingdom in Palestine, formed under King Saul in 1020 BC. Israel included the lands in Canaan, the promised land of the Hebrew tribes who descended from the people that Moses, 14th–13th century BC, led out of Egypt. But the kingdom was subsequently divided, and by the 8th century BC it had ceased to exist. Nevertheless, the area remained home and holy land to the Hebrews, Israelites, who had settled there. The entire region of Palestine, including the Kingdom of Israel, subsequently came under the control of various empires. Palestine saw the rule of the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Persians, The Macedonians under Macedonian King Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC. And the Romans, the area was the Roman province of Syria in the time of Jesus. After Roman rule, Palestine was, with only one exception, ruled by various Muslim Islamic dynasties, including the Ottoman Empire, 1516 to 1917. It was in 1917 that Palestine came under control of the British, who proclaimed in the Declaration of Balfour to support the establishment of a national home for the Jews living there. However, Britain reversed this policy in 1939 at the same time the area was seeing an influx of Jewish people who were escaping persecution in Europe. Jews in Palestine opposed British control, and at the same time fighting intensified between Jews and Arabs. The 1947 decision by the Union to establish a Jewish homeland resulted in nearly 2 years of fighting between Israelis and Arabs in the region. And though boundaries among the various states were determined anew in 1949, fighting in the region continued with the Arab-Israeli wars of 1956, 1967, 1973-74, and 1982. Unrest prevailed throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, when the two sides began discussions to resolve the long conflict.
Who are the members of the United Nations Security Council?
According to the UN Charter, the Security Council has 15 members. 5 permanent and 10 that are elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms. The permanent members are China, France, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The 10 temporary slots are elected annually, 5 nations at a time. So that on January 1, 2004, the following nations began 2-year memberships: Algeria, Benin, Brazil, the Philippines, and Romania. On January 1, 2005, Argentina, Denmark, Greece, Japan, and the United Republic of Tanzania began 2-year memberships. In 2005, Japan, Germany, India, and Brazil made bids for permanent seats on the Council.
What are the bodies and agencies of the United Nations?
The UN's Charter establishes 6 main bodies and explains their duties and operating methods. The General Assembly is the major forum, all member nations are represented there, and the Assembly can discuss any issue that is deemed relevant and important to the UN. The Security Council has the major responsibility for preserving peace. The Economic and Social Council investigates economic questions and works to improve living standards. The Secretariat is the UN's administrative body, helping all organs do their work. The Trusteeship Council assists non-self-governing territories, and the International Court of Justice hears disputes between member nations. Except for the last one, all bodies convene in the UN headquarters in New York City. The International Court of Justice meets in The Hague. Since the Charter was written in 1945, the United Nations has established numerous agencies, committees, and commissions to help carry out its work around the world. Among those that are most well known to the public are the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, which encourages the exchange of ideas among nations. The United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, which assists children and adolescents worldwide, particularly those in devastated areas or developing countries. The World Health Organization, WHO, which promotes high health standards around the globe. The International Labour Organization, ILO, which works to improve labor conditions and protect workers. And the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which addresses currency and trade issues.
Was Indira Gandhi related to Mohandas Gandhi?
No, the two were not related, except by events. After India achieved independence in 1947, the country's first Prime Minister was Jawaharlal Nehru. 1889 to 1964, who had been a follower of Mohandas Gandhi, 1869 to 1948. The great leader of India's long struggle for autonomy from Great Britain. During his entire tenure, 1947 to 64, as leader of India, Nehru was assisted by his only child, Indira, 1917 to 1984, who in 1942 married a man named Feroz Gandhi of no relation to Mohandas Gandhi. Indira Gandhi took an active role in India's national affairs. After her father died, she went on to become Prime Minister in 1966. However, hers was a troubled tenure. Found guilty of employing illegal election practices, Indira Gandhi was ousted by her political opponents in 1977. Determined to return to power, she was re-elected to Parliament in 1980 and again served as Prime Minister until her death in 1984. She was assassinated by two of her own security guards, Sikhs who were motivated by religious reasons. Her son and successor, Rajiv Gandhi, 1944 to 1991, was also assassinated, in 1991.
Why was the invention of barbed wire important to Western development?
Barbed wire was commercially developed in 1874 by American inventor Joseph Glidden, 1813 to 1906. Consisting of steel wires that are twisted together to make sharp points resembling thorns. The material was quickly implemented in the West to construct fences. With trees scarce on the Great Plains, farmers had lacked the materials to erect wooden fences. Instead they resorted to planting prickly shrubs as a way of defining their lands and confining livestock. However, this method was not always effective. With the advent of barbed wire, farmers were able to fence in their acreage. Cattle owners became angered by small farmers who put up barbed wire. They had previously allowed livestock to roam the open plain. Fearing depletion of grazing lands, ranchers also began using barbed wire to fence tracts. Whether or not they could claim legal title to them. Disputes arose between ranchers and farmers. In 1885, President Grover Cleveland, 1837 to 1908, brought an end to illegal fencing, ordering officials to remove barbed wire from public lands and Indian reservations. Legal use of the material to define land claim boundaries brought the demise of the open range and helped speed agricultural development of the prairie.
What was abscom?
Abscom was an undercover operation conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, to ferret out corrupt government officials and prosecute them. In 1978, agents began posing as American representatives of Arab businessmen whose company, the fictitious Abdul Enterprises Limited, was willing to buy political influence in the United States. Abscom comes from the first two letters of the business name, with the word scam added to the end. The trap was set. The first to be caught was Congressman Michael Ozzie Myers, 1943, of Pennsylvania, who was videotaped accepting a $50,000 bribe and saying, "I'm going to tell you something real simple and short: money talks in this business." Other officials also fell prey to the sting operation. All of them were arrested on charges of bribery and conspiracy. The first of 7 trials got underway in 1980. None of the officials were acquitted. Most faced fines and/or imprisonment, and all of them lost their offices. The wide net cast by Abscom had caught 1 U.S. Senator, 6 representatives in Congress, 1 mayor, 3 members of the Philadelphia City Council, 1 INS. Immigration and Naturalization Service inspector, 1 lawyer, 1 accountant, and many of their associates. The FBI operation and the resulting trials and punishments sent a loud warning to any public official subject to influence.
Was despotic Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu brought to justice?
In the 1989 trial of Nicolae Ceausescu, 1918 to 1989, and his wife Elena, 1919 to 1989, justice may not have been served. But many believed the tyrannical communist leader of Romania had indeed met with just desserts. The December 25 trial of the Ceausescus lasted all of 60 minutes. 55 minutes of questioning, to which the president's response was, "I do not recognize you, I do not recognize this court," followed by 5 minutes of deliberation. The court and judge were made up of the leaders in the popular rebellion that had begun December 16 When a pro-democracy rally attended by some 350,000 people ended in the Romanian armies and Ceausescu's secret police attacking unarmed demonstrators, killing several hundred men, women, and children. In demonstrations that followed, the Romanian army, long resentful of the privileged status enjoyed by the president's secret police, turned on Ceausescu's government, handing over automatic weapons to insurgents, whom they now joined in a popular uprising. On December 21, state television and radio came under the people's control, as did the Communist Party's central building and the Royal Palace, which were later found to be replete with luxuries and were also connected by a maze of tunnels. The Ceausescus and a few of their close associates tried to flee, but were captured on December 22, the same day that mass graves were found, revealing the secret police's torture and destruction of several hundred men, women, and children. The rebels drove the Ceausescus around for 3 days, averting the still loyal secret police. Realizing that time was not on their side, the captors assembled an extraordinary military tribunal in a small schoolroom at an army barracks. A defense lawyer was provided for Ceausescu. Counsel urged the former president to plead guilty by reason of insanity. He refused. The charges against Ceausescu included genocide, the massacre of demonstrators, and subversion of the economy for his own benefit. 1 hour later, the guilty verdict was delivered. Asked if they wished to appeal the decision, the Ceausescus remained silent. They were promptly taken outside, where a squad opened fire on the former president and his wife. Videotape of the brutal killings. The squad had fired as many as 30 rounds, was shown on Romanian television. By December 30 the country was controlled by rebel forces.
What is black gold?
Black gold is a term for oil or petroleum black because of its appearance when it comes out of the ground, and gold because it made prospectors, drillers, and oil industry men rich. The oil industry in the United States began in 1859 when retired railroad conductor Edwin L. Drake, 1819 to 1880, drilled a well near Titusville, Pennsylvania. His drill, powered by an old steam engine, struck oil. Oil from animal tallow and whales had been used as a lubricant since colonial times. The discovery of a process for deriving kerosene, a clean-burning and easy-lighting fuel, from coal oil had been patented in 1854. After Drake's Titusville well produced shale oil. The substance was analyzed for its properties and it, too, was determined to be an excellent source of kerosene. Soon others began prospecting for rock oil. Western Pennsylvania became an important oil-producing region. Wagons and river barges transported barrels to market. Later, the railroad reached into the region, and by 1875 a pipeline was built to carry the oil directly to Pittsburgh. Petroleum products soon replaced whale oil as a fluid for illumination. During the 1880s, Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana also produced oil. In 1901, the famous Spindletop field in eastern Texas produced the nation's first gusher. Oil literally sprang out of the earth. During the next decade, California and Oklahoma joined Texas to lead the nation's oil production. Between 1859 and 1900, U.S. oil production boomed. Just 2,000 barrels were produced the year it was discovered in Pennsylvania. More than 64 million barrels were produced annually by the turn of the century. The second half of the 1800s saw the oil industry boom. The fuel was used for lighting, heating, and lubrication, principally of machinery and tools. But the advent of the automobile and its central role in the life of 20th century America made the oil industry richer yet. Demand soon exceeded the nation's supply of petroleum, prompting the United States to increasingly rely on imported oil for fuel.
Why was Mohandas Gandhi called Mahatma?
Mohandas Gandhi was called Mahatma, meaning great-souled, by the common people, who viewed him as India's national and spiritual leader. He is considered the father of his country. He was born in India on October 2, 1869. As a young man, Gandhi studied law in Britain. Practicing briefly in India, he then travelled to British-controlled South Africa on business. Observing oppressive treatment of Indian immigrants there, he held his first campaign of passive resistance. Gandhi would later become very well known for this method of protest. Called satyagraha, meaning firmness in truth. Back in India as of 1915, Gandhi organized a movement of the people against the British government there. Britain had taken control of India during the 1700s and remained in power. After World War I, 1914-18, Indian nationalists fought what would be a long and sometimes bitter struggle for political independence. While Gandhi's protests took the form of nonviolent campaigns of civil disobedience, such as boycotts and fasts, hunger strikes, he was more than once arrested by the authorities for causing disorder. As his actions inspired more extreme measures on the part of his followers, whose protests took the form of rioting. As a member and, later, the president of India's chief political party, the Indian National Congress, Gandhi led a fight to rid the country of its rigid caste system, which organizes Indian society into distinct classes and groups. In Gandhi's time, not only were there four varna, or social classes, but there was a fifth group of untouchables who ranked even below the lowest class of peasants and laborers. Improving the lot of the untouchables was of tantamount importance to the leader, who by this time had abandoned Western ways in favor of a life of simplicity. Beginning in 1937, Gandhi became less active in government, giving up his official roles. but he continued to be regarded as a leader of the independence movement. During World War II, 1939–45, he was arrested for demanding British withdrawal from the conflict. Released from prison in 1944. Gandhi was central to the post-war negotiations that in 1947 resulted in an independent India. A believer in the unity of humankind under one God, he remained tolerant to Christian and Muslim beliefs. Amidst an outbreak of violence between Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi was on a prayer vigil in New Delhi when a Hindu fanatic fatally shot him in 1948.
When did diamond mining begin in Africa?
And 1867 discovery of a pretty pebble along the banks of the Orange River in South Africa led to the finding of a rich diamond field near present-day Kimberley. The city was founded as a result of the mining, in 1871. Similar to the California gold rush roughly a decade and a half earlier. The finding in central South Africa prompted people from Britain and other countries to flock to the area. However, the ultimate outcome was conflict, since both the British and the Boers, who were Dutch descendants living in South Africa, claimed the Kimberley area. The First Boer War ensued in 1880.
When did diamond mining begin in Africa?
And 1867 discovery of a pretty pebble along the banks of the Orange River in South Africa led to the finding of a rich diamond field near present-day Kimberley. The city was founded as a result of the mining, in 1871. Similar to the California gold rush roughly a decade and a half earlier. The finding in central South Africa prompted people from Britain and other countries to flock to the area. However, the ultimate outcome was conflict, since both the British and the Boers, who were Dutch descendants living in South Africa, claimed the Kimberley area. The First Boer War ensued in 1880.
How were finished goods produced before the Industrial Revolution?
Before the factory and machine age ushered in by the Industrial Revolution, people made many of their own finished goods, bought them from small-scale producers, who manufactured the goods largely by hand, or bought them from merchants who contracted homeworkers to produce goods. The putting out system was a production method that was used in New England from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s. It worked this way: merchants supplied raw materials, cotton, for example, to families, especially women and young girls, who would make partially finished goods, thread, or fully finished goods, cloth, for the merchant. These manufactured goods were then sold by the merchant. Homeworkers, who put out goods, provided the needed manufacturing labor of the day.
How were finished goods produced before the Industrial Revolution?
Before the factory and machine age ushered in by the Industrial Revolution, people made many of their own finished goods, bought them from small-scale producers, who manufactured the goods largely by hand, or bought them from merchants who contracted home workers to produce goods. The putting out system was a production method that was used in New England from the mid-1700s to the early 1800s. It worked this way: merchants supplied raw materials, cotton, for example, to families, especially women and young girls, who would make partially finished goods. Thread, or fully finished goods, cloth, for the merchant. These manufactured goods were then sold by the merchant. Home workers, who put out goods, provided the needed manufacturing labor of the day.
How did the textile industry begin?
The large-scale factory production of textiles began in the late 1700s, becoming established first in Great Britain, where a cotton spinning machine was invented in 1783 by Richard Arkwright, 1732 to 1792. Spinning mills were introduced to the United States in 1790 by English-born machinist and businessman Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835. The 21-year-old had worked as a textile laborer for more than 6 years in an English mill, where he learned the workings of Arkwright's machine, which the British considered the cornerstone of their booming textiles industry. Laws prevented anyone with knowledge of the mill from leaving the country. In 1789 Slater, determined he could recreate the spinning mill and eager to seek his own fortune, disguised himself to evade the authorities and leave the country, sailing from England for American shores. Arriving in Providence, Rhode Island, he formed a partnership with the textiles firm Amey and Brown. Slater began building a spinning mill based on the Arkwright machine. This he did from memory. The spinning mill was debuted December 20, 1790, in the village of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where the wheels of the mill were turned by the waters of the Blackstone River. The machine was a success and soon revolutionized the American textiles industry, which previously relied on cottage workers, the putting out system, to manufacture thread and yarn. Slater's innovation, which would earn him the title father of the American textiles industry, spawned the factory system in the United States. By 1815 there were 165 cotton mills in New England, all working to capacity. The early mills were not large-scale, however, and for a time after Slater's introductions, New England mills and merchants continued to rely on home workers to weave threads, now produced by the mills, into cloth. In 1813 the Boston Manufacturing Company opened the first textile factory, where laborers ran spinning and weaving machines to produce woven cloth from start to finish. The advent of machinery had given rise to the factory system, and laborers were shifted from working in their homes to working in factories. While native New Englanders continued to provide the labor for the textile industry for the next 2 decades. An influx of immigrants in the mid-1800s provided the hungry manufacturers with a steady supply of laborers who were willing to work for less money and longer hours. Within the first 3 decades of the 1800s, New England became the center of the nation's textiles industry. The region's ample rivers and streams provided the necessary water power, and the commercial centers of Boston and New York City readily received the finished products. Labor proved to be in ample supply as well. Since the mill machinery was not complicated, children could operate it and did. Slater hired children ages 7 to 14 to run the mill, a practice that other New England textile factories also adopted. The Jefferson Embargo of 1807, which prohibited importing textiles, also aided the industry. New England's mills provided the model for the American factory system. Slater had brought the Industrial Revolution to America.
How did the textile industry begin?
The large-scale factory production of textiles began in the late 1700s, becoming established first in Great Britain, where a cotton spinning machine was invented in 1783 by Richard Arkwright, 1732 to 1792. Spinning mills were introduced to the United States in 1790 by English-born machinist and businessman Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835. The 21-year-old had worked as a textile laborer for more than 6 years in an English mill where he learned the workings of Arkwright's machine, which the British considered the cornerstone of their booming textiles industry. Laws prevented anyone with knowledge of the mill from leaving the country. In 1789 Slater, determined he could recreate the spinning mill and eager to seek his own fortune, disguised himself to evade the authorities and leave the country, sailing from England for American shores. Arriving in Providence, Rhode Island, he formed a partnership with the textiles firm Amey and Brown. Slater began building a spinning mill based on the Arkwright machine. This he did from memory. The spinning mill was debuted December 20, 1790, in the village of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where the wheels of the mill were turned by the waters of the Blackstone River. The machine was a success and soon revolutionized the American textiles industry, which previously relied on cottage workers, the putting out system, to manufacture thread and yarn. Slater's innovation, which would earn him the title Father of the American textiles industry, spawned the factory system in the United States. By 1815 there were 165 cotton mills in New England, all working to capacity. The early mills were not large-scale, however, and for a time after Slater's introductions, New England mills and merchants continued to rely on home workers to weave threads, now produced by the mills, into cloth. In 1813 the Boston Manufacturing Company opened the first textile factory, where laborers ran spinning and weaving machines to produce woven cloth from start to finish. The advent of machinery had given rise to the factory system, and laborers were shifted from working in their homes to working in factories, while native New Englanders continued to provide the labor for the textile industry for the next 2 decades. An influx of immigrants in the mid-1800s provided the hungry manufacturers with a steady supply of laborers who were willing to work for less money and longer hours. Within the first 3 decades of the 1800s, New England became the center of the nation's textiles industry. The region's ample rivers and streams provided the necessary water power, and the commercial centers of Boston and New York City readily received the finished products. Labor proved to be in ample supply as well. Since the mill machinery was not complicated, children could operate it and did. Slater hired children ages 7 to 14 to run the mill, a practice that other New England textile factories also adopted. The Jefferson Embargo of 1807, which prohibited importing textiles, also aided the industry. New England's mills provided the model for the American factory system. Slater had brought the Industrial Revolution to America.
How did Eli Whitney invent the cotton gin?
American inventor Eli Whitney, 1765 to 1825, is credited with developing the cotton gin, a machine that removes cotton seeds from cotton fibers. A simple cotton gin, called the churka, dates back to ancient India. 300 BC. But Whitney's gin would prove to be far superior. In 1792 Whitney, who had recently graduated from Yale University, was visiting the Georgia plantation owned by Catherine Littlefield Greene, widow of American Revolution, 1775 to 83, hero General Nathaniel Greene, 1742-1786. Whitney observed that short staple, or upland, cotton, which has green seeds that are difficult to separate from the fiber, differs from long staple, also called sea island, cotton, which has black seeds that are easily separated. The latter was the staple of American commerce at the time. In 1793 Whitney, who is described as a mechanical genius, completed an invention that could be used to clean bowls of short staple cotton of their seeds. He patented it the next year. The machine worked by turning a crank, which caused a cylinder covered with wire teeth to revolve. The teeth pulled the cotton fiber, carrying it through slots in the cylinder as it revolved. Since the slots were too small for the seeds, they were left behind. A roller with brushes then removed the fibers from the wire teeth. The cotton gin revolutionized the American textiles industry, which was then but a fledgling concern. The increase in cotton production was as much as 50-fold. One large gin could process 50 times the cotton that a slave laborer could in a day. Soon plantations and farms were supplying huge amounts of cotton to textile mills in the Northeast. Where in 1790 another inventor, British-born industrialist Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835, had built the first successful water-powered machines for spinning cotton. Together the inventions founded the American cotton industry. Whitney struggled to protect his patent, but imitations of his invention were already in production, prompting the U.S. government to allow his patent to expire. Though he did not profit from his cotton gin, he went on to devise a system of interchangeable parts, which introduced the idea of mass production and revolutionized manufacturing.
How did Eli Whitney invent the cotton gin?
American inventor Eli Whitney, 1765 to 1825, is credited with developing the cotton gin, a machine that removes cotton seeds from cotton fibers. A simple cotton gin, called the churka, dates back to ancient India, 300 BC. But Whitney's gin would prove to be far superior. In 1792 Whitney, who had recently graduated from Yale University, was visiting the Georgia plantation owned by Catherine Littlefield Greene, widow of American Revolution, 1775 to 83, hero General Nathaniel Greene, 1742 1786. Whitney observed that short staple, or upland, cotton, which has green seeds that are difficult to separate from the fiber, differs from long staple, also called sea island, cotton, which has black seeds that are easily separated. The latter was the staple of American commerce at the time. In 1793 Whitney, who is described as a mechanical genius, completed an invention that could be used to clean bowls of short staple cotton of their seeds. He patented it the next year. The machine worked by turning a crank, which caused a cylinder covered with wire teeth to revolve. The teeth pulled the cotton fiber, carrying it through slots in the cylinder as it revolved. Since the slots were too small for the seeds, they were left behind. A roller with brushes then removed the fibers from the wire teeth. The cotton gin revolutionized the American textiles industry, which was then but a fledgling concern. The increase in cotton production was as much as 50-fold. One large gin could process 50 times the cotton that a slave laborer could in a day. Soon plantations and farms were supplying huge amounts of cotton to textile mills in the Northeast. Where in 1790 another inventor, British-born industrialist Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835, had built the first successful water-powered machines for spinning cotton. Together the inventions founded the American cotton industry. Whitney struggled to protect his patent, but imitations of his invention were already in production, prompting the U.S. government to allow his patent to expire. Though he did not profit from his cotton gin, he went on to devise a system of interchangeable parts, which introduced the idea of mass production and revolutionized manufacturing.